They thought the story ended the moment she walked out. 18 years, reduced to a sentence, a nod, and a quiet exit that barely disturbed the polished glass walls behind her. No argument. No scene. Just the soft click of a door closing on everything she had built. Inside, they exhaled too early, because what they didn't see wasn't the exit. It was the transfer of gravity. 8 seconds. That's all it took for a message to reach someone who had been watching closely. Someone who understood exactly what had just been discarded. And in rooms far more expensive than theirs, screens lit up. Numbers moved. Attention shifted. Because sometimes the most dangerous move in a system isn't firing someone. It's revealing their value to the wrong people. By 9:12 a.m., the building had already decided she no longer belonged to it. Not officially. Not in any memo you could forward or archive. But in the way conversations shortened when she approached. In the way eye contact broke a fraction too early. In the subtle choreography of people already adjusting to a version of the company without her. Glass walls have a way of reflecting more than they reveal. She noticed everything. The assistant who used to smile now nodded instead. The manager who once asked for her input now avoided her calendar. Even the system, her system, felt different, as if someone had already started preparing it for a new owner. 18 years doesn't disappear loudly. It erodes. Quietly, strategically. Until one morning you realize you're no longer part of the architecture, just a temporary function inside it. She didn't rush. That was the first thing that unsettled them. No defensive emails, no last-minute meetings, no popitki ispravit situaciju. Instead, she moved with the same precision she always had. Reviewing numbers, aligning reports, closing loops no one else even knew existed. Because she understood something they didn't. When systems are complex enough, removal is never instant. There's always a lag, and in that lag, control lives. At 10:03, the meeting invite arrived. Subject line: role transition discussion. Clean, neutral, almost polite. Almost. She opened it, read it once, and didn't react. No spike of emoji, no visible shift. Just a slight pause. The kind you'd miss if you weren't trained to notice patterns. Across the floor, someone was already watching her. They wanted a reaction. People always do. They expect noise, resistance, something they can point to and say, "See? This is why." But she gave them nothing, because reactions create records, and records can be used. At 10:17, she walked into the room. The CEO didn't stand. He didn't need to. Authority, in his mind, was already settled. "We've decided to move in a different direction," he said, as if reading from something rehearsed but intentionally memorized to feel spontaneous. No acknowledgement of time, no recognition of scale. Just a decision, presented as inevitability. Around the table, silence performed agreement. She listened. Not to the words, those were predictable, but to the structure behind them, the gaps, the omissions, because what isn't said is usually more expensive. "We found someone who aligns better with where we're going." There it was, replacement. Clean, efficient, final. She nodded, calmly, precisely, as if confirming a detail in a report. And that's when the room shifted, just slightly, because they expected friction. And instead, they got acceptance. But acceptance in the wrong hands is indistinguishable from strategy. She didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't ask why. Those questions are for people trying to stay. She wasn't. "Understood," she said. One word. No excess. And for a moment, it felt like control had fully transferred. Like the system had already updated itself. Like the outcome was sealed. But systems like this don't break at the point of impact. They break at the point of dependency. And no one in that room had asked the only question that mattered. What exactly had just been removed? Because outside that room, Beyond the polished table and curated certainty, there were processes still running, decisions still rooting, structures still relying on something they had just disconnected. And those structures had memory. By the end of this morning, it will become clear. They didn't just make a decision. They triggered a chain reaction that can no longer be stopped. By 10:41, the company was still functioning perfectly. Dashboards were green, pipelines were moving. Nothing, at least on the surface, suggested that anything irreversible had just happened. That's the illusion of well-built systems. They don't fail immediately. They continue just long enough for the mistake to feel justified. On the operations floor, someone refreshed a report and frowned. A minor delay. Nothing critical. Not yet. In finance, a reconciliation task looped once, then twice, before resolving itself. An anomaly. Logged. Ignored. Because systems are designed to compensate, to absorb shock, to smooth over gaps. But compensation has limits, and no one had calculated how much of that system depended on one invisible layer, the one she had spent years building, refining, protecting from exactly this kind of decision. At 11:06, the first escalation request was drafted. It wasn't urgent, not flagged high priority, just unusual. A dependency path wasn't resolving. A dataset wasn't validating against its own logic. Someone assumed it was a permissions issue. It wasn't. It was a memory issue. Because what she built wasn't just process. It was context. And context doesn't transfer. Back in her office, still technically hers, she was finishing something they didn't know existed. A final alignment. Not sabotage, not revenge. Just closure. Every system has edges, places where continuity depends on a specific understanding, a nuance no documentation can fully capture. She knew exactly where those edges were, because she designed them. At 11:18, her screen displayed the last sequence, a quiet confirmation. No alerts, no warnings, just a system acknowledging that a key node was no longer active. Elsewhere, they didn't see it. Not yet. They were still in the comfort window, that brief period where everything appears stable, even elegant. The CEO had already moved on to the next meeting. The replacement had already been introduced. Handshakes, smiles, forward-looking language. Exciting direction. Fresh perspective. Words that always sound expensive, until they are. At 11:27, the first real fracture appeared. A report failed to generate. Not delayed. Failed. Someone retried it. Same result. They escalated. Still not urgent, but now noticeable. At 11:31, a second system flagged an inconsistency. Two sources that had always matched suddenly didn't. A variance small enough to question, large enough to matter. Questions began to form. Quiet ones, internal ones, the kind that move faster than emails. At 11:34, someone asked the simplest question in the building. Who owns this flow? Silence. Not the dramatic kind. The operational kind, where no one immediately answers because everyone assumes someone else will. But no one did. Because ownership in this case wasn't assigned. It was embodied. And that embodiment had just walked out of the building. Back in the conference room, the replacement was explaining a plan. Clean slides, confident tone. But one question, small, precise, cut through it. How does this integrate with the legacy routing logic? A pause. Just long enough. Because legacy in this company didn't mean old. It meant foundational. And no one in that room fully understood it. Except the person they had just replaced. At 11:39, the system attempted another compensation cycle. It failed, this time, visibly. An alert triggered, then another. And suddenly the illusion, that fragile, carefully maintained illusion, began to crack. Not loudly, but definitively. Because when a system loses context, it doesn't collapse instantly. It fragments, small breaks, disconnected outputs, decisions that no longer align, and each fragment costs. At 11:42, an external partner sent a message. Short, direct. Can you confirm the deal routing? We're seeing inconsistencies. That message didn't go to her. It couldn't. It landed on a team that had never had to answer that question alone. And for the first time that day, they realized something was missing. Not a role, not a person, a layer. The one that translated complexity into certainty. The one that made a $60 million deal feel routine. Across the city, in a different building, someone opened a file. A familiar name appeared on the screen. A history of decisions, a pattern of precision, and a gap, recent, sudden, unexplained, interest sharpened. Because in systems like this, talent isn't just valuable, it's transferable. And sometimes, timing is the only signal that matters. By 12 o'clock, they will still be trying to stabilize the system, but it will already be clear. This isn't a failure. It's an absence. And someone else has already realized it. If you've ever seen a system shift like this, not with noise, but with silence, you already understand what just happened. And if you're still watching, you're seeing it unfold in real time. Because moments like this don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves, slowly, precisely, to those who pay attention to structure, not surface. So before we go further, drop a comment. At what moment did you realize the system had already lost control? Hit like if you've ever seen value underestimated, right before it became expensive. And subscribe, because what happens next isn't chaos. It's recalculation. And that's where things become irreversible. By 12:07, the building had stopped pretending. Not completely. Not publicly. But internally, in the quiet channels where real decisions move, the tone had changed. No one said crisis. That word is too loud. Instead, language shifted into something colder, more precise. Variance, unresolved dependency, temporary misalignment. Words that sound controlled, while control is already slipping. In the operations channel, messages began to stack. Short, efficient, too efficient. Rerun failed. Still inconsistent. Need clarification on routing logic. Clarification. That word appeared 3 times in under 2 minutes. Because when context disappears, people don't panic immediately. They ask for explanation. And when explanation doesn't come, panic simply changes its shape. At 12:11, someone finally opened her last documentation folder, the one no one had needed before. Structured, clean, almost elegant. But something was missing. Not information, interpretation. Because documentation captures what? She carried why. And without why, systems don't guide. They guess. At 12:14, finance halted a partial validation. A small one, $2.8 million exposure. Contained, manageable. For now. At 12:16, a second hold was triggered, $7.4 million. Different stream. Same root issue. Someone finally said it out loud. This connects to her layer. Not her role. Her layer. That word changed everything. Because roles can be reassigned. Layers have to be understood. And understanding takes time. Time they no longer had. In the executive corridor, doors that usually stayed open were now closed. Not locked. Just shut enough to signal that conversations inside were no longer for the floor. At 12:19, the CEO received the first consolidated summary. 3 lines. No adjectives. Just numbers. And a final note. Escalation likely if unresolved within 30 to 45 minutes. He read it once. Then again. Because the numbers weren't large enough to justify concern. Yet. But they were aligned in a way that felt familiar. as if something central, not visible, but critical, had been removed. Across the table, the new hire was still speaking, still presenting, still trying to establish authority in a system that no longer behaved predictably. And for the first time, their confidence didn't land. Because authority in structured environments doesn't come from position. It comes from continuity. And continuity had just broken. At 12:23, an external flag arrived. Not a complaint, a hesitation. We're pausing confirmation until routing is verified. That's how $60 million deals slow down. Not through rejection, through doubt. And doubt compounds faster than error. Someone in legal asked a quiet question. Who validated this transition? No one answered immediately, because validation in this case had been assumed, not executed. At 12:26, the system attempted a fallback sequence, a rarely used path designed for resilience. It initiated, processed, then stopped. No error, just no completion, which is worse, because errors can be fixed. Silence has to be interpreted. Back at her desk, now technically no longer hers, her screen was dark. Everything closed, everything aligned, no loose ends, because she hadn't removed anything. She had simply finished her part. And systems don't break when something is taken. They break when something essential is no longer maintained. At 12:31, someone finally said the sentence no one wanted to be the first to say, "We need to call her." Silence followed. Not resistance, recognition. Because calling her would mean admitting something far more expensive than a technical issue. It would mean admitting miscalculation. And miscalculation at this level carries a cost far beyond numbers. Across the city, in that other building, the file had already been reviewed twice. Patterns confirmed. Dependencies mapped. Impact estimated. No hesitation. Because from the outside, it was clear. What had been removed wasn't a person. It was leverage. And leverage always finds a new owner. By 12:35, they will already be discussing her return. But the question won't be whether she will come back. It will be, on what terms? By 12:38, the conversation was no longer about systems. It was about terms. Not written yet, not formalized, but unmistakably present in the way decisions were now being framed. How fast can we stabilize? What's the exposure if this extends? What are our options? Options. That word only appears when control has already shifted. In the executive room, the energy had changed. Not chaotic. Worse, measured, because panic reacts. But recalculation negotiates. At 12:40, the CEO finally asked the question he had avoided since 10:17. What would it take to restore continuity? No one answered immediately, because continuity in this case wasn't a switch. It was a relationship. And relationships don't respond well to being replaced. Across the table, someone from legal adjusted their tone. Careful, neutral. If we engage, we need to define scope. Scope, another precise word. Because they understood something now. She wouldn't be coming back as an employee. At 12:43, finance updated the exposure. $12.6 million. And climbing. Not lost. Not yet. But suspended. Frozen in a state that prevents growth, blocks movement, and quietly accumulates pressure. And pressure in structured systems doesn't release. It escalates. At 12:45, the external partner sent a second message. Shorter. Colder. We're redirecting attention until confirmation is provided. That's how deals don't die. They migrate. Across the city, in that other building, the same deal was now open on a different screen. Same numbers, different context. And context changes value. The lead investor didn't need a full briefing. Just one question. Is she available? A pause. Then, yes. No hesitation. No committee. no delay. Because in environments where decisions move fast, clarity is currency. And they had just been handed both. Back in the original building, someone drafted the message. Version 1, too formal. Version 2, too direct. Version 3, too late. Because timing, once lost, doesn't reset. It compounds. At 12:48, the CEO read the draft, deleted 2 sentences, rewrote the opening line, then stopped. Because tone in moments like this isn't stylistic. It's strategic. Too confident, and you sound unaware. Too soft, and you signal weakness. And she would notice. She always noticed. At 12:50, the system triggered another alert, this time tied directly to the deal. Routing incomplete, validation pending, external confirmation, on hold. The $60 million number, once stable, predictable, was now fluid. And fluid numbers make people nervous. At 12:52, someone finally asked, "What if she doesn't respond?" Silence. Because that scenario had no clean model, no fallback, no elegant solution, just cost. And not just financial, reputational, operational, structural. Because once a system reveals dependency at this level, it doesn't forget. At 12:54, the message was sent. Simple, carefully worded, no mention of urgency, though urgency saturated every line. No admission of error, though error defined the moment. Just an opening. A controlled attempt to reestablish a connection that had been severed too cleanly. Across the city, her phone lit up. She saw the name. Didn't open it immediately, because response timing is also leverage. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had changed. Traffic moved. People walked. Decisions happened in buildings that would never intersect. But inside these two systems, separated by distance, connected by one decision, everything had already shifted. Because this was no longer about being replaced. It was about being revalued. And revaluation rarely happens on the original terms. By 1300, it will become clear who truly controls the situation. But it will already be a different dynamic. A dynamic in which silence costs more than words. By 12:59, both buildings were waiting. Not for data, not for confirmation. For her. In the original office, screens were still active, alerts still blinking, conversations still moving in controlled loops that no longer resolved anything. They had done everything correctly. Escalated, documented, aligned internally. And yet, nothing moved. Because systems don't respond to effort. They respond to structure. And the structure, the one that made everything flow, was now outside the building. At 13:01, she finally opened the message. Read it once. No visible reaction. No shift in posture. Just a quiet understanding of something that had already been decided. Not by them, but by the sequence they had set in motion hours earlier. The message was careful, professional, almost respectful. It spoke about continuity, alignment, temporary engagement. It avoided the one word that mattered, return, because they knew. She wouldn't. At 13:03, a second message appeared. Different sender, different tone, direct, clear. Available for a quick call? We'd like to discuss a transition opportunity. Terms flexible. No hesitation, no subtext, just intent. She looked at both, side by side, two systems, two approaches, one still trying to restore what it had lost, the other already calculating what it could gain. And in that moment, the decision wasn't emotional. It was architectural, because she didn't belong to either company. She belonged to the layer both of them needed. At 13:05 in the original building, someone refreshed the dashboard again. Still unresolved. The same alerts. The same silent gaps where certainty used to be. But now there was something else. Time. Not the passing of it. The cost of it. Because every minute without resolution wasn't neutral. It was expensive. At 13:07, the CEO checked his phone. No response. Not yet. And for the first time that day, uncertainty stopped being theoretical. It became personal. Because control, once assumed, had now left the room. Across the city, the investor was already preparing terms. Not reactive. Strategic. Because they understood the moment. This wasn't hiring. This was acquisition of leverage. At 13:09, her phone was still in her hand. 2 messages, 2 directions. One trying to rebuild the past, the other offering control over the future. She chose neither. Not immediately. Because the most powerful move at this stage is not choosing. It's defining the conditions under which a choice becomes possible. At 13:11, she replied. One message. Short. Precise. Available after 1400. Send scope and decision authority. No emoji. No explanation. Just structure. In the original building, when the notification appeared, it didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. Because now it was no longer about whether she would respond. It was about whether they could meet what she would require. And that question was far more expensive. Across the city, the reply landed differently. Not as a challenge, as confirmation, because they were already prepared. At 13:14, both sides began drafting. Not emails, terms, because the system had fully shifted, no longer reacting to her absence, now negotiating for her presence. And presence at this level is never free. By 13:20, the numbers would change again. Not on dashboards, on contracts. Because what started as a replacement had become a revaluation event. And in systems like this, revaluation doesn't restore balance. It resets it. Quietly. Precisely. Irreversibly.